If you lined up every population on Earth, side by their DNA, one nation would stand closer to Mexico than almost anyone expects. It isn't Spain, it isn't the United States, and it's definitely not who you're thinking of right now. Today we're ranking the closest genetic relatives to the Mexican people, and the answer changes depending on which century of their DNA you're asking about. Here's the trap most people fall into. They think Mexican is a single genetic category, like a single country has one DNA fingerprint. It doesn't. Modern Mexico is one of the most genetically layered nations on the planet, built from 3 deep ancestral rivers that collided over the last 500 years. To find out who's genetically closest to Mexicans, we actually have to ask 3 separate questions. Who's closest in ancient ancestry? Who's closest in colonial era ancestry? And who's closest in the modern population as it exists today? Stick around because the answer to the third question is the one nobody expects. Let's go back first. All the way back, more than 15,000 years, to the last ice age. Genetic studies trace the ancestors of indigenous Mexican populations to small founding groups that crossed from Siberia into the Americas via the Beringian land bridge. Once in the Americas, these populations spread south over thousands of years, splitting into thousands of distinct nations: the Maya, the Zapotec, the Nahua, the Purepecha, and hundreds more. So on the deepest genetic level, the closest relatives to indigenous Mexicans aren't in Europe at all. They're the other indigenous nations of the Americas, from the indigenous peoples of Guatemala and Belize through Colombia, all the way to the indigenous populations of Peru and Bolivia. Genetically, indigenous Mexican populations cluster most tightly with indigenous Central American groups first, then more broadly with indigenous South American populations. A single ancient American lineage, separated more by geography and time than by any hard genetic wall. And further back still, that lineage's closest overseas relatives are indigenous Siberian populations, like the Chukchi and the Koryak, the closest living echo of the ancestors who made that crossing. But that's only the oldest layer. 500 years ago, a second river of DNA arrived, and it changed everything. To understand who's closest to Mexicans today, we need to cross the Atlantic. Starting in 1521, Spanish colonization introduced a new and lasting genetic signature into Mexico, concentrated overwhelmingly in settlers from southern and western Spain, particularly Andalusia, Extremadura, and Castile. Genetic studies consistently show that the European component in the modern Mexican genome traces most closely to these specific Spanish regions, more than to France, Italy, or Northern Europe. That makes Spaniards, and specifically Southern and Western Spaniards, the closest European genetic relatives to modern Mexicans. But the story doesn't stop with Spain and indigenous nations alone. Beginning in the 1500s, enslaved West and Central Africans were also brought into Mexico, particularly along the Gulf Coast in states like Veracruz and Guerrero. Their descendants, Afro-Mexican communities, remain an essential, if historically under-acknowledged, thread in the country's genetic tapestry. So by the colonial era, Mexico's genetic closest relatives had expanded to 3 continents: Indigenous America, Southern Spain, and West/Central Africa. Fast forward to today. The average Mexican genome is now a blend, typically somewhere between 50 to 60% Indigenous American, 30 to 45% European, and a smaller but genetically real percentage of African ancestry, with the exact ratio varying enormously by region. Southern states like Oaxaca and Yucatan skew far more indigenous. Northern states like Chihuahua and Nuevo León skew more European. This is why geneticists don't talk about the Mexican genome as one thing. They talk about a spectrum. And this is exactly why the question who's closest to Mexicans has such a surprising answer. It's not one nation. It's an entire genetic family of populations built from the exact same 3-way blend. So here's the answer nobody expects. The populations genetically closest to modern Mexicans are not in Europe or Africa at all. They're the other mestizo nations of Latin America, built from the exact same admixture recipe. Population genetics studies consistently place Guatemalans, Hondurans, and Salvadorans as the closest genetic neighbors to Mexicans, largely because of shared Mesoamerican indigenous roots combined with a similar Spanish colonial layer. Slightly further out genetically, but still remarkably close, are Colombians and other northern South American populations, who share the same 3-way admixture pattern in different proportions. Even Filipinos carry a small, fascinating echo of this connection, not through deep ancestry, but through history. For 2.5 centuries, The Manila Galleon trade linked Mexico directly to the Philippines, and small amounts of Mexican and Spanish ancestry entered Filipino communities, while Filipino sailors settled in coastal Mexican towns like Guerrero. Genetically distant but historically intertwined. Here's what makes Mexico even more complex. The country isn't genetically uniform within its own borders. Geneticists studying regional populations have found that the far south, in states like Oaxaca, Chiapas, and the Yucatan Peninsula, carries the highest indigenous ancestry percentages in the entire country, often exceeding 70%, tracing directly to Zapotec, Mixtec, and Maya lineages that never fully blended with colonial settlers. Move north into Chihuahua, Sonora, and Nuevo Leon, and the ratio flips. European ancestry climbs, in some sampled populations approaching half the genome. A legacy of denser Spanish settlement patterns and smaller indigenous population density in the arid north. And tucked into the Sierra Madre, the Rarámuri, and other highland indigenous nations remain some of the most genetically isolated populations in North America, having intermarried far less with outside populations than almost any other group on the continent. What this means is that a person from Mérida and a person from Monterrey can carry meaningfully different ancestry proportions, both fully Mexican, both genetically distinct. Mexico isn't one population's DNA. It's a spectrum stretched across 2,000 miles. Now widen the lens past the mainland. The Caribbean tells a strikingly similar story to Mexico's, just with the dial turned differently. Populations in Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba were shaped by the same three ancestral rivers. Indigenous, in this case Taíno rather than Mesoamerican. European, again overwhelmingly Spanish, and West/Central African in far higher proportions than in most of Mexico, a direct legacy of the intensive plantation economies built on the islands. Studies of Puerto Rican populations, for example, often show African ancestry proportions rivaling or exceeding the European component, the opposite emphasis from most of mainland Mexico, where indigenous ancestry dominates the non-European share. So, genetically, Caribbean nations sit in the same admixture family as Mexico, same three ingredients. But the recipe's proportions shift the further the population sits from Mesoamerica and the deeper it was shaped by plantation-era slavery. It's a reminder that this entire genetic story, from Mexico down through Central America and out into the Caribbean, is really one shared history of colonization playing out in different local proportions. For viewers who've taken a consumer DNA test, here's what's actually happening under the hood. Maternal line ancestry tracked through mitochondrial DNA shows the vast majority of Mexicans carry Indigenous American haplogroups, mainly groups labeled A, B, C, and D by geneticists, meaning most Mexican family trees, followed purely through the mother's line, lead back to Indigenous American women. Paternal line ancestry, tracked through the Y chromosome, tells a strikingly different story. A large share of Mexican men carry haplogroup R1b, the same paternal lineage dominant in Spain and much of Western Europe, a genetic fingerprint of the colonial era pattern where European men fathered children with indigenous women, far more often than the reverse. That asymmetry, written directly into maternal versus paternal DNA, is one of the clearest genetic signatures of colonization anywhere in the world, and it's not unique to Mexico. The same maternal indigenous, paternal European pattern shows up across nearly all of Latin America, from Guatemala to Colombia to Chile, which is part of why these nations read as such close genetic relatives to begin with. If you've ever opened a DNA test result and seen a breakdown like Indigenous Americas, Iberian Peninsula, and Sub-Saharan African, now you know exactly why. Consumer ancestry companies build their estimates by comparing your DNA against reference panels, collections of DNA from people with well-documented ancestry in specific regions. Because Mexico's genome is such a well-studied three-way blend, testing companies can estimate those regional percentages with reasonable confidence. But it's worth saying clearly, these percentages are estimates, not certainties, and they shift slightly as reference panels improve. A result showing 52% Indigenous American, 41% Iberian, 7% Sub-Saharan. African isn't a precise fact carved in stone. It's the best current statistical estimate of where your ancestors most likely lived generations ago. Understanding that distinction is exactly what separates real population genetics from oversimplified headlines. Now, an important distinction because it matters. Genetic ancestry and ethnicity are not the same thing. Ethnicity is cultural, linguistic, and self-identified. DNA only tells us about biological descent. It can't tell you someone's language, traditions, or identity. Population geneticists are careful to separate the two, and so are we. What DNA can tell us is where a population's ancestors came from. What it can't tell us is who a people are today. So, who has the closest DNA to Mexicans? Ancient answer: other indigenous nations of the Americas, tracing back to a shared migration out of Siberia. Colonial answer: Southern Spaniards and West/Central Africans, whose descendants arrived over 5 centuries of contact. Modern answer: the one most people never see coming: Guatemalans, Hondurans, Salvadorans, and Colombians. Nations built from the same 3-continent blend, in slightly different proportions. Mexico isn't genetically an island. It's the center of an entire genetic family stretching from Mesoamerica down through the Andes, with historic threads reaching as far as the Philippines. The closest DNA to Mexicans was never one answer. It was always 3. If this changed how you think about ancestry, subscribe. Because next week, we're ranking the closest DNA relatives to another nation you'd never guess. And drop a comment. Where do your ancestors trace back to? I read everyone.